I was sitting in my cardiologist's upscale Chicago office for a routine checkup when a photo on his desk caught my eye. It was my wife of 35 years wearing a backless red dress I had bought her, a dress she claimed she had returned. When the doctor walked in, I casually asked who the woman was. His face immediately lit up. He smiled and said it was his fiancée. He told me they were getting married as soon as she finalized her split from her old abusive husband. My heart stopped, but my face remained like stone. What he did next was even more chilling. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through a betrayal while planning your next move. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, and I built Cole Development from the ground up, turning empty Chicago lots into a real estate empire. I have spent my entire adult life negotiating with cutthroat developers, ruthless city politicians, and corporate sharks. I thought I knew how to spot a liar. I thought I knew exactly how to protect myself and my assets. But I never imagined the greatest threat to my life would come from the woman sleeping next to me and the doctor holding my medical chart. It all started 6 months ago, when I suffered a mild heart attack. It was a severe wake-up call. I handed more of the daily corporate operations over to my 40-year-old son, Bradley, and focused entirely on my recovery. My wife, Diane, insisted I see the absolute best specialist in the state. That is how I ended up as a patient of Dr. Preston Caldwell at a highly exclusive private hospital in the city. Caldwell was 52 years old, charming, arrogant, and carried the kind of quiet smugness you only find in men who think they are the smartest person in any room. On that particular Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting alone in his private consultation room, waiting for him to review my latest electrocardiogram. The room smelled of expensive leather and clinical sterility. As I sat there tapping my fingers on the armrest, my gaze drifted across his massive mahogany desk. It was cluttered with medical journals and thick patient files. But peeking out from behind a stack of manila folders was a silver picture frame. It had been knocked over, lying half face down. Call it the instinct of a man who has spent 40 years reading the fine print, but something compelled me to reach over and flip that frame upright. I forgot how to breathe. The photograph was of Diane. She was wearing a stunning backless crimson silk dress. I knew that dress intimately because I was the one who bought it for her in Paris for our 35th wedding anniversary just last month. When I had asked her to wear it for our anniversary dinner, she told me it was too flashy for a woman of 60. She looked me right in the eye and promised she had already returned it to the boutique. Yet here she was in a silver frame on my cardiologist's desk. In the photograph, she was laughing radiantly, her head resting intimately against the chest of a man wearing a crisp white medical coat. His arm was wrapped tightly around her waist. Her smile was genuine and carefree, a smile I had not seen directed at me in over a decade. Before my brain could even fully process the magnitude of what I was looking at, the heavy oak door clicked open. I quickly set the frame down, leaving it upright just as Caldwell strolled into the room, his eyes glued to a medical tablet. He was humming a cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the hurricane raging inside my chest. He looked up, gave me his polished, practiced smile, and sat down across from me. I leaned back in my chair. I forced my heart rate to steady, pulling on the same cold poker face I used when dismantling rival firms. I pointed casually at the desk. I asked him, keeping my voice light and conversational, who the beautiful woman in the picture was. Caldwell did not even flinch. He did not hesitate. Instead, a proud, almost boastful grin spread across his face. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and sighed like a man who had won the lottery. "Oh, that is my fiancée," he said, his voice dripping with affection. "She is an absolutely wonderful woman. We are planning a winter wedding in Aspen. We just have to wait a little bit longer for her to finalize things with her current husband. He is a miserable, abusive old man who refuses to let her go, but his time is running out. His time is running out." The words hung in the air between us heavily. An abusive old husband. A winter wedding. I looked at the doctor who was supposed to be keeping me alive. He was smiling at me, completely unaware that the abusive old man he was talking about was sitting 3 feet away from him. Diane had obviously never shown him a picture of me, or she had fed him a completely different narrative. I was a very private man. I kept my face out of the society pages and business magazines. To him, I was just Harrison, another wealthy, ailing senior citizen with a failing heart. I smiled gently. I told him congratulations and that she looked very familiar. He chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. She gets that a lot. She has one of those classic faces. Let us get back to your heart, Harrison. He picked up his tablet, and his cheerful demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a grave, deeply concerned medical persona. It was an incredible performance. He swiped through my charts, shaking his head slowly, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Harrison. I am going to be straight with you, he said, leaning forward and lowering his voice. Your blood pressure is terrible today. The electrocardiogram is showing significant deterioration in your ventricular function. Your heart is failing much faster than I anticipated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a prescription pad. The medication you are currently on is no longer sufficient. I am putting you on a new, much higher dosage protocol starting today. He scribbled violently on the pad and tore the sheet off, handing it to me with a dead, serious look in his eyes. You need to fill this immediately. You must take these new pills exactly as directed. 2 in the morning, 2 at night. Do not miss a single dose. If you do not follow this regimen perfectly, Harrison, your heart will simply give out. You will not survive the winter. I took the slip of paper from his hand. My fingers were completely steady. I looked down at the chemical names scrawled across the page, and then I looked back up into the eyes of the man who was sleeping with my wife. The man who had just gleefully informed me that his fiancée was waiting for her husband to step out of the picture. The man who was now handing me a new aggressive medical protocol. I thanked him for his care. I told him I would go straight to the pharmacy. As I walked out of the hospital and into the biting Chicago wind, the pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Diane did not want a divorce. With our prenuptial agreement, a divorce would leave her with a modest stipend and nothing more. But as my widow, she would inherit my real estate empire, the liquid assets, the properties. Everything I had built over 40 years would fall directly into her lap. My wife was not just cheating on me. She and my cardiologist were planning my funeral. They were confident, they were arrogant, and they thought I was just a clueless, dying old man who would obediently swallow whatever pills he was handed. They thought they held all the cards, but they had no idea the kind of monster they had just woken up. I was not going to be their victim. I was going to be their absolute ruin. The drive from downtown Chicago to my estate in Lake Forest usually took about 45 minutes. That afternoon, it felt like it took 3 lifetimes. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the cold Illinois asphalt was the only sound keeping me grounded in reality. My mind was a violent storm of calculations, memories, and fractured trust. For 35 years, I had built a fortress around my family. I had shielded my wife from every hardship, provided a life of unimaginable luxury, and trusted her completely. Now every shared smile, every anniversary toast, every quiet moment over morning coffee felt like a meticulously rehearsed scene in a play where I was the only one unaware of the tragic ending. I pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of our estate. The property was sprawling, sitting on 3 acres of pristine land overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a monument to my success, but as I parked the car and stared at the grand stone facade, it suddenly looked like a beautifully decorated tomb. I took a slow, deep breath, burying the titan of industry and the betrayed husband deep down inside. When I walked through those heavy oak doors, I needed to be the man they expected. I needed to be the vulnerable, aging billionaire with a failing heart. The moment I stepped into the grand foyer, the scent of fresh lilies and expensive vanilla candles washed over me. Diane was in the living room arranging a massive bouquet of white hydrangeas in a crystal vase. She turned as I entered, her face lighting up with that flawless, practiced warmth I had fallen for decades ago. She was wearing a tailored beige cashmere sweater and pearl earrings, looking every inch the devoted, elegant matriarch of the Cole family. She wiped her hands on a linen towel and walked briskly toward me, her eyes brimming with manufactured concern. She asked me how the appointment went, her voice laced with the perfect amount of anxious tremor. She reached out and gently rested her cool, manicured hands against my cheeks. I forced myself not to pull away from her touch. I looked her right in the eyes and delivered my lines flawlessly. I told her that the doctor was deeply concerned. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction, playing the part of a defeated man. I explained that my ventricular function was deteriorating rapidly and that he had prescribed a new, highly aggressive medication protocol. Diane let out a soft, dramatic gasp. She pulled me into a gentle embrace, resting her head against my chest. I felt her breathing slow and rhythmic, completely at odds with the panic she was pretending to feel. She whispered that everything would be all right, that we would fight this together, and that she would personally make sure I followed the doctor's orders to the letter. She pulled away and extended her hand, asking for the prescription bag I was holding. I handed it over without hesitation. She walked gracefully into the custom marble kitchen, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. I followed her, sitting on one of the velvet bar stools at the kitchen island. She opened the pharmacy bag, pulled out the amber plastic bottle, and examined the label. I watched her closely. There was no hesitation, no confusion. She moved with the smooth efficiency of someone who already knew exactly what was inside that bottle. She popped the child-proof cap, shook 2 small, pale blue pills into the palm of her hand, and filled a crystal glass with ice water from the refrigerator dispenser. She slid the pills and the water across the granite countertop toward me. She smiled tenderly, telling me it was time for my first dose. I looked at the 2 blue pills resting in my palm. They looked completely harmless. Just standard medicine meant to keep an old man alive. I picked them up slowly. Before I put them in my mouth, I looked up at her. I kept my tone light, almost nostalgic. I told her that seeing the doctor today had made me think about our anniversary last month. I mentioned how much I loved that backless crimson silk dress I bought for her in Paris. I casually asked if she was absolutely certain she wanted to keep it returned, suggesting I could have my assistant call the boutique and repurchase it for her to wear at the upcoming charity gala. Diane did not blink. Her heart rate did not increase. Her breathing remained perfectly steady. She let out a light musical laugh and reached over to pat my hand. She told me I was sweet for offering, but she had already returned it to Neiman Marcus weeks ago. She looked me directly in the eyes and said the color was simply too bright for a woman her age and she preferred to dress more conservatively now. It was a masterclass in deception. A lie delivered with such absolute conviction and casual grace that if I had not seen that silver frame on Caldwell's desk with my own 2 eyes, I would have believed her completely. I smiled back. I told her it was a shame, but I respected her choice. Inside my chest, however, my gut was screaming. The cold, analytical part of my brain, the part that had ruthlessly dismantled rival corporations for 4 decades, began tearing her narrative to shreds. Why was she doing this? Why not simply ask for a divorce? She no longer loved me. She clearly wanted to be with Preston Caldwell. A divorce would be the logical, civilized route for a woman of her social standing. But then the reality of our financial structure hit me with the force of a freight train. Our prenuptial agreement. I had drafted it 35 years ago, and I had updated it every 5 years. It was an ironclad document designed to protect the Cole development empire. If Diane filed for divorce or if her infidelity was proven in a court of law, she would walk away with a modest monthly stipend and a single condominium. She would lose the Lake Forest estate. She would lose access to the private jets. She would lose the unlimited credit cards the charity board positions and the immense social power that came with being the wife of Harrison Cole. She loved luxury more than any man. She would never trade the life of a billionaire for the life of a mere doctor's wife, unless she did not have to, unless she found a way to keep the entire fortune and the doctor. The sickening truth crystallized in my mind. Finalizing the split did not mean signing divorce papers in a lawyer's office. It meant burying me in a mahogany casket. She was not leaving me. She was liquidating me. He was the supplier. My wife was the executioner. Diane tapped the granite counter gently, her voice soft and encouraging. She told me to drink up, reminding me of what the doctor said about following the regimen perfectly. I nodded. I swallowed the cold water, but kept the pills tucked securely against the roof of my mouth. I offered Diane a slow, reassuring smile. I told her I was feeling a bit tired from the appointment and excused myself to the powder room down the hall. As soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut, I spat the 2 blue capsules into a linen handkerchief, folded it carefully, and buried it deep inside my jacket pocket. I rinsed my mouth, splashed some cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I was a man surrounded by vipers in my own home. When I walked back out into the grand foyer, the heavy brass knocker on our front door was echoing through the house. Diane looked genuinely surprised. We were not expecting any company. The housekeeper opened the door, revealing my son Bradley and his wife Megan standing on the threshold. Bradley looked absolutely frantic. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and he was clutching a thick leather portfolio tightly against his chest. Megan was standing slightly behind him, her face fixed in an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. She rushed forward past the housekeeper and threw her arms around my neck. She held me tight, pressing her cheek against my shoulder, and whispered how terribly worried they had been all afternoon. I patted her back mechanically, feeling the chill of her designer perfume sink into my clothes. Bradley stepped inside and dropped his leather portfolio heavily onto the entryway table. He looked at me with wide, panicked eyes and asked if we could sit down immediately. He said there was no time to waste and that we needed to have a very serious family discussion. Diane played the role of the concerned mother perfectly. She guided us all into the formal dining room, ordering the staff to leave us completely alone for the evening. We gathered around the long, polished walnut table under the dim glow of the crystal chandelier. Bradley did not even wait for anyone to sit down properly before he opened his portfolio. He slid a dense stack of legal documents across the smooth wood directly toward me. I recognized the corporate header instantly. It was an emergency power of attorney alongside a full operational transfer agreement for the Riverfront Horizon project. That project was the absolute crown jewel of coal development. It was a $150 million commercial complex downtown that I had spent the last 3 years securing permits and funding for. It was my ultimate legacy project. Bradley leaned forward, placing both his hands flat on the table. He told me that Dr. Caldwell had called him personally just an hour ago. He claimed the doctor was deeply alarmed by the results of my latest electrocardiogram. Bradley's voice cracked perfectly as he recounted the supposed conversation. He said the doctor told him my heart was failing rapidly and that any continued stress from the company would induce a fatal cardiac arrest within weeks. He begged me to step down immediately. He pleaded with me to sign the documents and hand him full executive control of the project to save my own life. I looked at my son, searching for any trace of the boy I had raised. I had given him every possible advantage in this world. I had paid for his Ivy League education, handed him a prestigious title at my firm, and provided an endless safety net for all his previous financial mistakes. He had always been weak, lacking the ruthless instinct required to run a real estate empire. Yet here he was, attempting to orchestrate a hostile takeover under the guise of familial devotion. Diane poured herself a glass of sparkling water, her hand completely steady. She looked at me with profound sadness and whispered that Bradley was right. She said we had enough money to last 100 lifetimes, and that it was absolutely crucial for me to step away before the stress killed me. Megan immediately chimed in, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. Her voice was soft, soothing, and dripping with lethal sweetness. She looked at me with large, sympathetic eyes and said that my health was the only thing that mattered to this family. She softly reminded me that the company and all its assets would eventually belong to Bradley anyway. She urged me to let go of the burden, to retire in peace with Diane, and to let my son carry the weight of the empire I had built. She squeezed my fingers gently and told me it was time to rest. It was a beautiful, deeply moving performance. If I had not seen that photograph on the doctor's desk, I would have looked at my son and my daughter-in-law and felt an overwhelming sense of pride. I would have believed they were stepping up to protect their aging father from the crushing stress of the corporate world. But the illusion was completely shattered. As I looked down at the documents, my mind processed the massive, glaring flaw in their narrative. Dr. Caldwell was a highly respected physician at a top-tier medical facility. He was bound by strict federal privacy laws. There was absolutely no logical reason a doctor of his caliber would completely bypass patient confidentiality to call my son before even discussing the severe prognosis with me directly. Furthermore, why would a medical doctor advise the immediate transfer of a specific $150 million real estate development? The sheer absurdity of it was staggering. This was not a medical intervention. It was a highly coordinated corporate coup. My son, my daughter-in-law, my wife, and my doctor had formed a syndicate against me. They were using my failing health as the perfect weapon to strip me of my empire before I even had the chance to die. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting the heavy atmosphere settle over the dining room. They watched me with breathless anticipation, waiting for the broken old man to surrender. Bradley tapped his expensive gold pen against the table, a nervous habit he had carried since childhood whenever he was lying. Megan continued to trace slow circles on the back of my hand, her touch feeling more like a shackle than a comfort. Diane dabbed the corner of her perfectly dry eye with a linen napkin. It was a masterpiece of deception. I slowly pulled the documents closer to me, pretending that my hands were shaking just enough to sell my vulnerability. I told them I needed time to read through everything carefully before making such a monumental decision about my life work. Bradley tried to push the pen into my fingers, insisting that every hour counted for my survival. But I simply closed the folder and smiled weakly. I promised I would review it tonight and give them my final answer tomorrow morning. I needed them to leave my home immediately and without delay. I needed the quiet, isolated space to silently prepare my ruthless weapons for the absolute war that was rapidly coming. As soon as the heavy front door closed behind my son and his wife, I felt a sudden wave of absolute clarity wash over me. The suffocating tension in the dining room dissipated, leaving behind a cold, sterile silence that seemed to press against the walls of the sprawling house. Diane lingered near the entryway, watching me with that same fabricated expression of matronly concern. She gently suggested that I head upstairs to rest, reminding me again of the fragility of my condition. I gave her a curt nod, telling her I just needed an hour in my study to review the contract Bradley had brought. I promised her I would not overexert myself. She kissed my cheek lightly and glided toward the master staircase, her performance flawless to the very end. I walked down the long mahogany hallway to my private office. When I stepped inside, I shut the thick oak door and turned the brass lock until it clicked firmly into place. I walked over to my desk and turned on the single brass reading lamp. The room was bathed in a warm amber glow, highlighting the framed photographs of my early building projects and the awards I had earned through decades of relentless labor. I sat down in my leather chair and placed Bradley's leather portfolio squarely in the center of the desk. My hands were no longer shaking. The weakness I had projected in the dining room evaporated completely. I opened the portfolio and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to scrutinize every single line of text. I have spent my entire adult life navigating complex real estate acquisitions, zoning laws, and corporate mergers. I know how lawyers hide landmines in the dense paragraphs of boilerplate language. Bradley was banking on the assumption that a dying, frightened old man would simply sign the last page without reading the fine print. He thought I was too exhausted to notice the details. He was gravely mistaken about who he was dealing with in this high-stakes arrangement. I read through the standard clauses regarding executive succession and power of attorney. They were standard aggressive, but standard. Then I reached the financial authorization section for the Riverfront Horizon development. It was buried deep on page 47 under a subheading about initial vendor disbursements. My eyes locked onto a specific clause that authorized an immediate unconditional transfer of $20 million from our primary operational account to a third-party logistics vendor. The vendor was listed in bold black ink as Apex Ventures Incorporated, a completely unfamiliar entity. I stared at that name for a long time. In all my years of running coal development, I had never once done business with a firm by that name. We had a strict vetted list of approved contractors and logistics partners for projects of this magnitude. Apex Ventures was completely unknown to me. I pulled out my secure laptop and logged into our private corporate registry database. I ran a quick search on the name. The company had been incorporated in Delaware less than 3 weeks ago. It had no physical office address, no history of construction logistics, and a registered agent that traced back to a generic post office box. It was a classic shell company. The sheer unbelievable audacity of their interconnected scheme made my blood run absolutely cold in my veins. Bradley was not trying to protect me from corporate stress. He was trying to drain $20 million of liquid capital from my flagship project into an untraceable black hole the moment I handed him the keys to the kingdom. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the dark wood of the ceiling. The scattered pieces of this grotesque puzzle began pulling themselves together with terrifying precision. It was an intricate, brilliantly cruel trap. Diane and Caldwell desperately wanted me dead, so they could quietly inherit the vast majority of my financial estate without ever triggering the severe penalties of our ironclad prenuptial agreement. But Bradley and Megan wanted cash immediately. They were using my supposed rapid medical decline as the perfect cover story to execute a massive financial heist. Caldwell provides the terrifying medical prognosis that gives Bradley the excuse to demand emergency executive control. Megan plays the sympathetic daughter-in-law, pushing me to surrender my power gracefully. Diane plays the devoted wife, making sure I take the very pills that are meant to slowly stop my heart. They were systematically isolating me, stripping me of my authority, my money, and my life, all while smiling directly into my face. It was a flawless, coordinated execution designed by the people I had trusted most in this world. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the small private bathroom attached to my office. I closed the door and turned on the bright vanity lights. I reached deep into my tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out the folded linen handkerchief. I carefully unfolded it, revealing the 2 small blue pills Caldwell had prescribed. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, yes. The gray in my hair was prominent, and the lines around my eyes told the story of a lifetime of grueling work. But I was not a weak old fool. I was Harrison Cole. I built a billion-dollar empire by destroying men who were far smarter and far more ruthless than my spoiled son and my treacherous wife. I walked slowly over to the porcelain toilet and tossed the 2 poisonous blue pills directly into the bowl. I pressed the silver handle and watched the swirling water swallow the poison, pulling it down into the dark pipes. I opened the medicine cabinet above the sink. I searched through the various bottles until I found a container of generic vitamin supplements. I opened it and poured the contents onto the counter. The vitamins were small, pale blue capsules. They were nearly identical in size and shape to the lethal medication Caldwell had handed me. I carefully gathered the harmless vitamins and transferred them into the amber pharmacy bottle with Caldwell's label on it. I would play their game. I would take their medicine every single morning and every single night right in front of Diane. I would let them believe that their sinister plot was working perfectly. I would let them celebrate my impending demise. I needed them to feel completely safe and entirely victorious, because a comfortable, unthreatened enemy is always a careless, vulnerable enemy. I gripped the edges of the marble sink and stared fiercely into my own eyes. I made a fierce, silent, solemn vow to myself, right then and there in the cold light. I was going to survive this. I was going to stay alive long enough to watch their perfect little conspiracy crumble into dust. I would gather my remaining strength securely, lock down my vast financial assets, and then I would finally strike back with a terrifying vengeance they could not possibly begin to comprehend. I needed to move very fast, and in complete absolute silence starting right now today. The first 3 days, without Preston Caldwell's prescribed medication, were a revelation that felt like a physical resurrection. For 6 months, I had lived in a suffocating, gray fog. I convinced myself that the constant fatigue, the heavy ache in my chest, and the lethargy in my limbs were simply natural consequences of a cardiac event. I accepted the exhaustion because the doctor and the woman who shared my bed told me it was completely normal. They had conditioned me to believe my rapid decline was an unavoidable tragedy. But by the morning of the 3rd day off, the pills, the veil over my cognitive faculties completely lifted. My vision sharpened. The dull throbbing in my left arm vanished. When I stood up from my leather chair, I did not feel dizzy. My lungs expanded, drawing in deep pulls of air without hesitation. I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of vitality coursing through my veins. It was the undeniable, raw, physical energy of a man no longer being actively poisoned. The realization was horrifying. My heart was not failing. It was functioning perfectly. It had been fighting against a relentless chemical assault, orchestrated by the people who smiled at me every single day. I did not need rest. I needed irrefutable proof. I could not use any medical facility in Chicago or the surrounding Illinois suburbs. My name carried too much weight, and Caldwell had massive professional connections throughout the state. If I submitted the pills to a local laboratory, the results might be flagged, alerting my enemies. I had to disappear entirely off the grid. On Thursday morning, I told Diane I was spending the day at the downtown corporate archives to review old property deeds. I kissed her cheek, felt the coldness of her skin against mine, and walked out the door. Instead of taking my chauffeured town car, I drove myself in an older discreet sedan I kept in the secondary garage. I left my primary cell phone sitting on my office desk to ensure my location could not be tracked. I drove south, crossing the state line into Indiana. The flat, sprawling landscape of the Midwest whipped past my windows as I drove for 2 solid hours. I was a billionaire titan of industry driving like a fugitive trying to outrun his own murder. I navigated to a small industrial park in the outskirts of Gary. It was a bleak, unassuming area surrounded by chain-link fences and concrete warehouses. Tucked away in a sterile brick building was a private, independent biochemical testing facility. I had found it through a secure, untraceable search the night before. It catered to private agricultural and pharmaceutical clients, requiring strict non-disclosure agreements and rapid testing. It was the perfect place for a man who did not exist to ask a question he was terrified to answer. I walked through the glass double doors into a quiet, sterile reception area. The air smelled strongly of antiseptic and ozone. A young man in a white lab coat approached the counter. I introduced myself as Arthur Pendleton, a fictitious name I had used decades ago when scouting anonymous real estate acquisitions. I told him I needed a highly expedited mass spectrometry and comprehensive toxicological breakdown of a proprietary compound. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a generic plastic container holding 6 of the blue pills I had palmed from Diane. I placed the container softly on the metal counter. I explained that I needed to know the exact chemical composition, the active ingredients, and the physiological effects of the compound. The technician informed me that a full expedited analysis would be incredibly expensive and highly irregular for a walk-in client. I did not argue. I simply opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. I laid $4,000 in untraceable cash directly onto the cold metal counter. I told him I needed the results by 4:00 that afternoon, and that absolute discretion was mandatory. He looked at the cash, then at me, and nodded silently. He scooped the money and the pills into a secure tray and disappeared into the back laboratory. I spent the next 5 hours sitting in a faded vinyl booth at a rundown diner across the highway. I ordered a black coffee and left it untouched. I stared out the dirty window, watching the trucks rumble past, feeling a profound, chilling isolation. I had spent 40 years building an empire to protect my family. I had given Bradley every opportunity. I had given Diane a life of absolute splendor. I had shielded them from the harsh realities of the world. And in return, they had woven a brilliant, deadly net around my neck. They were not just waiting for me to die. They were actively orchestrating it, managing my demise with the casual efficiency of a corporate merger. The sheer logistical audacity of it made me sick to my stomach. I was not a husband or a father to them. I was merely a lingering obstacle standing between them and a mountain of cash. At precisely 4:00, I walked back through the glass doors of the testing facility. The young technician was waiting for me at the counter, holding a thick manila folder. His expression had completely changed. He looked extremely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side. He slid the folder across the counter and asked me in a hushed voice where I had acquired those specific pills. I kept my face entirely impassive, asking him to simply explain the findings. He opened the report and pointed to a dense column of chemical readouts. He explained that he had run the compounds against multiple pharmaceutical databases because the results made absolutely no medical sense. The pills were entirely devoid of any beta blockers, statins, or ACE inhibitors. There was absolutely no cardiovascular medication in the compound whatsoever. Instead, the blue pills were a highly concentrated, sophisticated, and lethal cocktail. The primary ingredient was a potent synthetic sedative designed to suppress the central nervous system, keeping the patient in a state of constant, severe lethargy. The secondary ingredient, he explained with a trembling voice, was a slow-acting, unlisted paralytic agent. It was a chemical compound frequently used in experimental muscle relaxants. Taken in small daily doses, it would incrementally degrade cardiac muscle tissue. It would steadily lower the resting heart rate, weaken the ventricular walls, and systematically simulate the exact progression of aggressive natural heart failure. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. He told me that if a human being ingested this cocktail consistently for 6 months, their heart would simply stop. And because the compounds mimicked natural cardiac decay, a standard post-mortem autopsy would show absolutely nothing suspicious. I stared at the paper, absorbing the clinical reality of my assassination. Dr. Caldwell had engineered a flawless medical execution. Diane had happily administered the poison to me every morning and every night, with a loving smile on her face. Bradley and Megan were waiting to collect my empire. I was going to destroy them all entirely. I walked out of the testing facility and immediately drove to a nearby electronics store. I purchased a cheap prepaid cell phone, paying in cash. I could not risk using my personal devices for what needed to happen next. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan and dialed 2 numbers I had memorized decades ago. The first was Jonathan Reed, my personal attorney. Jonathan and I had navigated the treacherous waters of Chicago real estate together for over 30 years. He was the only man who knew the absolute totality of my financial empire. The second number belonged to Victor Shaw. Victor was a retired federal investigator who now operated a highly exclusive private intelligence firm. He specialized in corporate espionage and tracking hidden assets. I told them both to cancel their afternoon schedules and meet me at a specific address on the south side of Chicago. I emphasized that they were to arrive in unremarkable vehicles and pay for everything in cash. They knew my tone. Neither of them asked any questions. The location I chose was a gritty, weathered diner tucked under the rusted steel beams of the elevated train tracks. It was a place where construction workers and night shift mechanics drank black coffee out of chipped ceramic mugs. There were no security cameras, no reservation logs, and absolutely no chance of running into anyone from my social circle. I arrived first and slid into a dimly lit corner booth facing the entrance. The vinyl seats were cracked, and the air smelled heavily of fried onions and old cooking oil. It was a staggering contrast to the Michelin-starred restaurants Diane frequented, but right now it was the safest room in the entire city. 20 minutes later, Jonathan walked through the door. He was wearing a simple gray trench coat over his usual custom-tailored suit. Victor arrived moments after him, dressed casually in a dark sweater and a worn leather jacket. They slid into the booth opposite me. Both men looked incredibly tense. They knew that a meeting like this meant a catastrophic crisis was unfolding. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder containing the toxicological report. I slid it across the sticky laminate table toward Jonathan. I told them my wife and my son were actively trying to murder me. Jonathan let out a sharp breath. Victor narrowed his eyes and reached for the folder. He read through the chemical breakdown of the pills, his professional demeanor instantly shifting into cold, focused anger. I explained everything to them in a low, steady voice. I detailed the conversation I had with Caldwell, the photograph of the red dress on his desk, and the lethal pills Diane was happily feeding me every night. Then I brought up the corporate documents Bradley had tried to force me to sign. I told them about the $20 million diversion into the newly formed shell company called Apex Ventures. Jonathan took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked physically ill. He had watched Bradley grow up. He had drafted Diane's prenuptial agreement. He told me this was treason on an unprecedented scale. He asked me if I wanted him to contact the district attorney immediately. I shook my head firmly. I told him absolutely not. If we went to the authorities now, they would lawyer up, hide the money, and claim I was suffering from severe paranoia induced by my heart condition. I needed undeniable, irrefutable proof that linked all of them directly to the assassination plot and the financial embezzlement. I turned to Victor. I told him I needed his team to blanket my family in a web of invisible surveillance. I needed to hear every conversation and track every single movement they made. Victor nodded, pulling a small leather notebook from his jacket. He asked for the primary targets. I told him to start with Bradley. I ordered him to infiltrate the executive suites at Cole Development and plant micro-audio bugs directly inside my son's private office. I wanted ears on every phone call he made and every meeting he hosted. Next, I gave him Diane. I told him to install a military-grade global positioning tracker on her Mercedes. But I knew she was careful, so I went further. I told Victor to gain access to our home while she was out and plant listening devices deep inside the linings of her favorite designer handbags. I wanted to know exactly where she went when she claimed to be at her charity luncheons. Finally, I told him to bug Megan's car as well. Megan was the quiet manipulator, the whisperer behind Bradley's sudden surge of false confidence. I needed to know exactly what she was orchestrating in the shadows. Victor closed his notebook. He promised me the surveillance grid would be fully operational within 48 hours. He warned me it would be highly illegal, but I told him I no longer cared about the law. I only cared about survival. Then I turned my attention back to Jonathan. I told him his battlefield was going to be the financial records. I ordered him to tear Apex Ventures apart, layer by microscopic layer. I needed to know exactly who registered the company in Delaware, who sat on the hidden board of directors, and most importantly, where the bank accounts were located. I told him to trace every single dollar my son had moved over the past 3 years. I wanted to know how deep Bradley's debts went, and exactly who he owed money to. Jonathan nodded, pulling a pen from his pocket. He promised he would bring in his best forensic accountants to quietly audit the entire firm. I gave him a secondary directive. I told him to secretly begin drafting a completely new will and trust structure. I was going to systematically cut Diane Bradley and Megan out of every single asset I owned. If I died tomorrow, they would not receive a single penny of the empire I had built. Jonathan assured me the new legal framework would be airtight. We sat in that dark, dingy booth for another hour, refining the logistics of our counterattack. We mapped out every possible scenario, every potential risk, and every defensive measure. When we finally finished, our coffee had gone completely cold. I looked at the two men sitting across from me. They had been by my side through the most vicious corporate wars of my career. But this was no longer business. This was a battle for my actual life. I thanked them for their loyalty. I stood up from the cracked vinyl booth, leaving a $50 bill on the table. I walked out of the diner and back to my car, stepping into the freezing Midwestern wind that howled loudly through the incredibly desolate, empty city streets. I was driving back to a house filled with people who wanted to put me in the ground. But I was no longer the dying old man they thought I was. I was the ruthless architect of their impending destruction. I parked my discreet sedan back in the secondary garage and slipped into the massive, silent house. The charade had to continue flawlessly. For the next 3 days, I played my part with absolute precision. I took my vitamin pills in front of Diane, swallowing them with a weak smile while she gently stroked my hair. I walked with a slight shuffle, I feigned shortness of breath, and I spent hours resting in my study. My performance was so convincing that Diane actually began finalizing the guest list for her 60th birthday gala with an extra layer of cheerful enthusiasm. She was already planning her victory lap. But beneath my frail exterior, my mind was operating with a cold, terrifying clarity. I was waiting for the trap to spring. On the morning of the 4th day, my secure, prepaid cell phone vibrated in the locked bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled it out and saw Jonathan's number on the bright screen. His voice was unusually tight when he spoke. He told me he had the preliminary results from the forensic accountants. He said I needed to see the documents in person immediately. We arranged to meet at a private airstrip on the outskirts of the city, a place where I kept a small corporate jet. It was a completely secure and controlled environment, far away from the prying eyes of my family and their greedy conspirators. I told Diane I was going for a short, slow drive to clear my head. She kissed my cheek and told me not to tire myself out. I walked slowly to my parked car, feeling the immense weight of the impending revelation pressing down heavily on my tired shoulders. I already knew Jonathan had finally found the exact dark connection I had truly dreaded. I arrived at the hangar an hour later. Jonathan was already there, sitting at a polished conference table inside the private lounge. Spread out before him were dozens of financial spreadsheets, banking statements, and corporate registration documents. He looked up slowly as I walked in, and his expression was grim. He did not offer a greeting. He simply gestured to the chair across from him and slid a thick manila folder toward my hands. I sat down and opened the folder. The first page was a corporate charter for Apex Ventures Incorporated. Jonathan pointed to a highlighted section at the bottom of the page. He explained that navigating the corporate veil in Delaware was notoriously difficult, but his team had managed to pierce the outer layers of the shell company. Apex Ventures was absolutely not a vendor. It was clearly not a logistics firm. It was a hollow financial conduit. And the ultimate beneficial owners listed on the secondary hidden registry were Bradley Cole and his wife Megan. My ragged breath instantly caught deep in my throat. Seeing my son's name printed on that document was a visceral blow. I had suspected he was involved, but seeing the undeniable legal proof staring back at me shattered the last remaining fragment of my paternal denial. He was actively trying to steal $20 million directly from the Riverfront Horizon project. He was going to use my supposed medical decline as the perfect smokescreen for his massive embezzlement. I looked silently at Jonathan, patiently waiting for him to tell me we finally had enough solid evidence to permanently stop the transfer. But Jonathan shook his head slowly, his eyes reflecting a deep, profound sadness. He told me that the $20 million extraction was absolutely not the beginning of his massive theft. It was actually the desperate, frantic climax of a much larger and deadlier crisis. Jonathan flipped to the next page in the folder. He laid out a detailed timeline of internal corporate transfers dating back nearly 2 years. He explained that Bradley had been systematically draining smaller vulnerable accounts across my real estate empire for 24 months. He had targeted routine maintenance funds, reserve escrow accounts, and secondary property holding trusts. Because I had trusted him with operational oversight, he had the authority to move capital without triggering immediate alarms. He had siphoned off nearly $8 million before he ever brought that emergency power of attorney document to my dining room table. $8 million simply vanished into the ether. I stared blankly at the staggering numbers, feeling a cold, heavy knot form deep in my stomach. I immediately asked Jonathan exactly where all the money had gone. I knew Bradley lived a lavish lifestyle, but $8 million in 2 years was an astronomical sum even for him. Jonathan took a deep breath and pulled a final stack of papers from his briefcase. He explained that Victor Shaw had managed to intercept a series of highly encrypted communications on Megan's phone. Victor had cross-referenced those messages with the offshore banking data Jonathan had uncovered. The absolute truth was utterly catastrophic. Bradley was not simply greedy. He was in deep, terrifying trouble. He had developed a severe gambling addiction combined with a string of completely reckless offshore investments. But he had absolutely not borrowed this money from a traditional bank. He had recklessly borrowed money from a highly ruthless underground syndicate operating out of Chicago and Miami. The $8 million he stole from my company had barely covered the interest on his massive and rapidly escalating debts. Bradley currently owed the vicious cartel syndicate upwards of $15 million in debt. The deadline for repayment was rapidly approaching, and the people he owed were not the kind of people who negotiated terms. They were the kind of people who issued death sentences. The $20 million he was trying to extract through Apex Ventures was merely a frantic, desperate maneuver to completely pay off the syndicate and save his own miserable life. Megan was clearly the true hidden architect of the corporate extraction, repeatedly advising him on exactly which specific accounts to bleed dry and how to manipulate my failing health to secure the final massive payout. They were completely backed into a dark corner, utterly terrified of the brutal consequences of their own foolish actions. I sat in the quiet hum of the private hangar, absorbing the absolute totality of my son's failure. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was a pathetic, terrified coward. He had squandered every advantage I had ever given him. He had gambled away millions, and when the wolves finally came to his door, he did not stand and fight. He did not come to his father for help. Instead, he conspired with my treacherous wife and a greedy doctor to put me in the ground. He was entirely willing to trade my life to save his own skin. The sickening reality washed over me, leaving nothing but a vast, empty void where my love for him used to reside. I closed the manila folder and placed my hands flat on the polished table. I looked at Jonathan and told him to freeze every hidden account we could safely reach without alerting them. The deadly trap was finally set securely in place. I was now absolutely ready to pull the lever. The very next morning, the charade continued with sickening perfection. I was sitting in the sunlit solarium wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sipping a cup of herbal tea when Diane floated into the room. She looked absolutely immaculate. She was dressed in a tailored cream winter coat that draped elegantly over her shoulders, and a pair of dark designer sunglasses rested gently on top of her perfectly styled hair. Behind her, the housekeeper was rolling a matching set of pristine white leather luggage toward the heavy front door. Diane walked over to me, her heels clicking softly and deliberately on the imported tile floor. She leaned down and pressed a warm, lingering kiss against my cheek. She smelled of expensive floral perfume and absolute deceit. She told me she felt terribly guilty for leaving me alone while my health was so incredibly fragile. She claimed she had an unavoidable 3-day charity gala in Aspen, Colorado, that she simply could not cancel at the last minute. She placed her hand over my heart, her eyes shining with beautifully manufactured sympathy. She whispered for me to rest my heart and promised that Bradley would drop by to check on me every single afternoon. I gave her a weak, grateful smile, playing the role of the devoted, ailing husband. I told her to have a wonderful trip and to focus entirely on her philanthropic work. I watched her glide out the front door and step gracefully into the waiting luxury vehicle. The moment the taillights disappeared down the long, winding driveway, I dropped the wool blanket and walked straight to my secure phone. I dialed Victor Shaw immediately. I told him the target was on the move and heading south from Lake Forest. Victor was already in position. He had been stationed in an unmarked sedan a mile down the road, waiting patiently for my signal. I sat in my silent, empty house listening to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, waiting for his updates. I fully expected Victor to follow her directly to O'Hare International Airport. I assumed she was actually flying to Aspen, to rendezvous with Caldwell, under the guise of a high society charity event. But an hour later, my secure phone vibrated with a brief, urgent message. Victor informed me that the driver had completely bypassed the airport exits. The vehicle was maintaining a steady speed, heading deep into the heart of downtown Chicago. I told Victor to maintain a safe distance and keep me constantly updated on her exact coordinates. 30 minutes later, he called me directly. His voice was hushed and completely professional. He reported that Diane had arrived at an ultra-luxury high-rise building in the highly exclusive Gold Coast neighborhood. The building was widely known for its intense security private elevators and breathtaking panoramic views of Lake Michigan. Victor watched her exit the vehicle. She did not have the driver unload her heavy white leather luggage. Instead, she carried a single small overnight bag past the concierge desk and stepped directly into a private elevator bank. She was not going to the snowy mountains of Colorado. She was going to a private hidden sanctuary right here in my own city. I asked Victor if he could determine exactly which residential unit she was visiting. He told me it would take a little time to bypass the building's highly encrypted digital registry, but he had his ways. I paced the length of my study, my mind racing violently through the possibilities. I assumed Dr. Caldwell had rented an opulent penthouse using his lucrative medical salary to impress my wife. I imagined them up there celebrating their imminent financial windfall, toasting champagne to my rapidly failing heart. The absolute arrogance of it infuriated me, but I needed concrete, undeniable documentation. I needed to tie this specific location directly to Caldwell, so I could present it to my lawyers as irrefutable evidence of the ongoing affair. I waited in the agonizing silence of my sprawling home. The hours stretched on, feeling like an absolute eternity. The afternoon sun slowly dipped below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across my polished mahogany desk. Finally, the secure phone vibrated again on the table. Victor had successfully accessed the county property tax records and the building's private ownership registry. He sent me a secure, encrypted file containing the official deed and the comprehensive purchase history of the specific penthouse unit Diane had entered. I downloaded the attachment with trembling hands. Every second that passed felt like a heavy physical weight pressing firmly against my chest. I took a deep, steadying breath and braced myself for whatever horrible truth was waiting for me inside those legal documents. I opened the digital file on my laptop, expecting to see Preston Caldwell listed as the primary leaseholder or the registered owner. I scanned the first page of the complex legal document. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking the sheer, overwhelming stress was making me hallucinate. The luxurious property had not been rented. It had been purchased outright. It was a massive $4 million residential transaction paid entirely in untraceable cash just 3 weeks ago. But the name printed clearly on the official deed did not belong to the arrogant doctor. The registered owner of the luxury penthouse was Apex Ventures Incorporated. The air in my private study suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. I fell back into my leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer unbelievable magnitude of what I was reading. Apex Ventures was the exact same Delaware shell company my son Bradley had recently created to siphon $20 million from the Riverfront Horizon development project. The twisted depravity of their secret arrangement hit me with a sickening physical force. Bradley had not just stolen from his father to pay off a vicious criminal syndicate. He had blatantly taken $4 million of my hard-earned money and used it to purchase a secret romantic love nest for his mother and her lover. My own son was actively and knowingly financing his mother's illicit affair. He was intentionally funding the very doctor who was simultaneously and systematically poisoning me to death. They were all completely intertwined in a grotesque, seamless web of greed, betrayal, and absolute moral bankruptcy. The mother, the son, the daughter-in-law, and the doctor were operating efficiently as a single murderous unit. Bradley was buying Diane's complicity and permanent silence by giving her the ultimate luxury hideaway, while she personally ensured the doctor finished the brutal job of stopping my beating heart. I sat completely alone in the dark, absorbing the total annihilation of my entire family structure. I had loved them deeply. I had protected them fiercely. I had given them the entire world on a silver platter, and they had ruthlessly used every single gift I provided to meticulously dig my shallow grave. The profound sadness completely evaporated from my soul, leaving behind a cold, hardened, terrifying resolve. They desperately wanted a funeral. I was absolutely going to give them a spectacular one, but it would be their miserable lives going up in spectacular flames. The very next morning, Victor Shaw executed the next phase of our counteroffensive with absolute technical precision. We needed to penetrate the communication network between Megan Bradley and Dr. Caldwell without triggering a single alarm. Victor explained that Megan was the strategic hub of their entire operation. She was the one coordinating the timelines and managing Bradley's fragile nerves. Victor engineered a highly sophisticated digital phishing trap disguised as a routine security update for her private banking application. It was a flawless digital forgery. I sat in my dark office staring intently at the glowing screen of my secure laptop, waiting for the trap to spring. At precisely 10 in the morning, the notification flashed across my screen. Megan had taken the bait. She had clicked the disguised link, and within seconds her entire digital life was completely compromised. Victor had successfully cloned her mobile device. Every single text message, every hidden email, and every encrypted communication she sent or received was now being instantly mirrored directly onto my private server. I watched in cold fascination as the raw data began to stream across my monitor. The sheer volume of their ongoing deceit was staggering. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in the absolute darkness of my study, reading the unfiltered transcripts of their daily betrayal. Megan was ruthless. Her messages to my son were filled with cold, calculated instructions on how to handle the bank transfers and how to keep the Riverfront Horizon funds ready for immediate extraction. But her messages to Dr. Caldwell were what truly turned my blood into ice. They spoke with the casual intimacy of conspirators who had absolutely no fear of discovery. Caldwell texted her to confirm that Diane had arrived safely at the downtown penthouse the night before. Megan replied with a series of laughing emojis, joking about how gullible I was for believing the ridiculous Aspen charity story. They discussed my physical symptoms with clinical detachment. Caldwell assured Megan that based on the dosage Diane was administering, I would be completely incapacitated within 48 hours and deceased within the week. Reading my own murder schedule typed out in sterile blue text bubbles shattered any remaining illusion of their humanity. They were monsters hiding behind designer clothes and medical degrees. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across my mahogany desk, a new series of rapid messages began to illuminate the screen. Megan was initiating a group chat with both Bradley and Caldwell. My eyes locked onto the glowing text, tracking every single word as it appeared in real time. Megan was orchestrating a private gathering for that very evening. She told them that with Diane securely installed in the new $4 million penthouse and my health rapidly failing, it was finally time to celebrate their impending victory. She instructed Bradley to bring the final authorization papers for the Apex Ventures transfer. Caldwell replied that he would bring a bottle of vintage champagne to toast the swift approaching conclusion of our collective problem. They were all going to be in one room tonight. The mother, the son, the daughter-in-law, and the murderous doctor. They were gathering in the very sanctuary purchased with my stolen money to celebrate my imminent demise. The profound arrogance of their decision was their greatest vulnerability. They felt so incredibly safe in their deception that they were completely lowering their guard. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and let the profound silence of the sprawling house wash over me. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer just falling into place. They were locking together with the terrifying finality of a steel trap. Victor Shaw had not just pulled the property records for the Gold Coast penthouse the day before. He had utilized his extensive underground connections to bypass the building's elite security grid. While Diane was busy arranging her new designer wardrobe, Victor had quietly slipped into the luxury residence disguised as a routine maintenance worker. He had spent less than 20 minutes inside, but that was all the time a seasoned professional needed. He had successfully planted multiple micro-audio transmitters deep inside the living room upholstery, the dining area, and the master suite. Every single sound inside that $4 million love nest was now being continuously broadcast to a secure, encrypted frequency. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a pair of high-fidelity noise-canceling headphones. I plugged the heavy cord into the side of my encrypted laptop and securely fitted the padded cups over my ears. I opened the audio surveillance application Victor had installed and dialed in the specific frequency for the penthouse living room. At first, there was only the faint ambient hiss of the building's internal ventilation system. Then I heard the distinct heavy thud of the solid oak front door closing. I heard the sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The audio feed was incredibly crisp. I could hear the soft, rhythmic tapping of Diane's high heels crossing the hardwood floor. I heard a deep, masculine voice warmly greeting her. It was Preston Caldwell. His tone was smooth, confident, and dripping with unearned victory. I listened as he poured the champagne, the crystal glasses clinking together in a cheerful, sharp toast. He told my wife that she looked absolutely ravishing, and that their long, agonizing wait was finally coming to a beautiful end. Diane laughed that same light musical laugh she had used to charm me for decades. She told him that she had left me sitting in the solarium looking completely pathetic and thoroughly defeated. My hands gripped the edges of my desk tightly, my knuckles turned entirely white. I sat perfectly still, listening to the people I had cherished, methodically carving up my life. 15 minutes later, the front door chime echoed through the audio feed. I heard Caldwell walk across the room and open the door. Bradley and Megan arrived. My son's voice filtered through the headphones, loud and completely devoid of the nervous stutter he always used around me. He sounded arrogant, boastful, and entirely relieved. He proudly announced that he had the final transfer documents securely in his briefcase. He bragged about how easily he had manipulated the corporate accounts and how I was simply too weak and too exhausted to notice the massive bleeding of my own empire. Megan chimed in, her voice sharp and calculating. She reminded them all that they needed to remain perfectly focused for just a few more days until the heart failure was complete and the coroner signed the final death certificate. I listened as they clinked their glasses once again, toasting to their brilliant deception and my impending funeral. They were completely unaware that the walls of their sanctuary were actually recording their absolute ruin. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal no longer caused me any sorrow or grief. It only fueled my relentless desire for absolute vengeance. The trap was fully loaded and perfectly primed for execution. I closed my eyes and listened to the rats scurrying inside their gilded cage. I possessed every single piece of evidence I needed to destroy them all. The crisp sound of crystal glasses clinking together resonated through my high-fidelity headphones with a sickening clarity. I sat completely immobilized in the heavy darkness of my study. The amber glow of my single desk lamp cast long, distorted shadows across the mahogany furniture. Through the digital audio feed Victor Shaw had so expertly planted inside the $4 million penthouse, I heard my family celebrating my impending death. The ambient noise of the luxury apartment was incredibly clear. I could hear the soft, rhythmic hum of the central heating and the distant, muted sounds of the Chicago traffic far below them. But the voices of my wife, my son, my daughter-in-law, and my supposedly trusted physician overpowered everything else. They were laughing. It was not a nervous, hesitant laughter. It was the bold, unrestrained joy of conspirators who believed they had successfully executed the perfect crime. Dr. Caldwell was the first to speak. His deep, resonant voice filled my ears, carrying a tone of smug medical authority. He proudly announced that my cardiovascular degradation was progressing exactly according to his precise timeline. He told the room that based on the latest physical symptoms Diane had reported, my heart walls were fatally weakened. He confidently predicted that the final catastrophic cardiac event would occur within the next 72 hours. He actually congratulated Diane on her flawless daily administration of the poison. He praised her steady hand and her remarkable ability to maintain the facade of a grieving, terrified wife. Diane responded with a soft, musical sigh that I had heard 1,000 times before. She told Caldwell that the hardest part was simply pretending to care when she looked into my dull, fading eyes. She complained about the sheer exhaustion of holding my hand and listening to my raspy breathing. The casual, brutal cruelty of her words felt like a physical knife twisting deep inside my chest. Then my son Bradley spoke. His voice was sharp, frantic, and edged with a desperate kind of adrenaline. He asked Caldwell to guarantee the timeline. Bradley demanded absolute certainty that the coroner would not find anything suspicious during the mandatory autopsy. He sounded completely terrified, complaining that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Caldwell chuckled condescendingly, assuring Bradley that the synthetic paralytic compound was entirely undetectable by standard post-mortem toxicology screens. He promised my son that my death would be officially recorded as a tragic but highly predictable, massive heart attack. It was at this precise moment that Megan finally took control of the conversation. Her voice sliced through the room, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of human empathy. She commanded them all to calm down and focus on the final logistical execution of their brilliant financial heist. Megan began to methodically outline the absolute totality of their interconnected scheme. Listening to her lay out the facts was like watching a venomous snake uncoil in the center of my living room. She calmly reminded Bradley of the catastrophic stakes they were facing. She stated explicitly that he currently owed $15 million to a highly ruthless Chicago crime syndicate. She detailed his pathetic string of illegal offshore gambling losses and his completely reckless attempts to cover his massive debts using highly leveraged underground loans. Megan spoke of the cartel with a chilling detachment, reminding my son that these brutal men did not care about his elite pedigree or his corporate titles. They only cared about cash, and they had already threatened to break his legs if the first major payment was not delivered by the end of the month. Bradley whimpered softly in the background, a pathetic sound of sheer cowardice from a man I had spent my entire life trying to mold into a leader. Megan silenced him with a sharp reprimand. She told him to stop panicking because her flawless plan was going to save his miserable life. She clearly articulated the ultimate motive binding the four of them together in this murderous pact. The $20 million extraction through Apex Ventures had merely been a temporary contingency, a backup plan in case my heart took too long to finally fail. But the primary objective was always the complete and clean inheritance of my entire billion-dollar empire. Megan explained the sequence of events with terrifying corporate precision. First, Caldwell ensures my death is completely natural and entirely unquestioned. Second, Diane inherits the vast majority of my liquid assets and real estate holdings free and clear of any legal entanglements, because the ironclad prenuptial agreement only applied to a divorce, not a sudden tragic widowhood. The depravity of the next phase made my blood run cold. Megan detailed how Diane would transfer $30 million into Apex Ventures under the guise of a corporate investment. Bradley would use that perfectly laundered money to eradicate his $15 million debt, saving his own skin while keeping a fortune for himself and Megan. Diane, the grieving widow, would wait 6 months before publicly announcing her relationship with my cardiologist, Dr. Preston Caldwell. They would be married within a year, consolidating my vast wealth under Caldwell's control. It was a symbiotic circle of absolute evil. Bradley gets his life saved and his debts erased. Megan gets the enormous wealth and social status she always desperately craved. Caldwell gets access to a billion-dollar fortune without building a single company. Diane gets to play the tragic heroine trading her older husband for a younger doctor while keeping every penny of my money. They were all perfectly complicit in my calculated assassination. Every single one of them stood to gain everything the very second my heart stopped beating in my chest. I sat in the dark listening to them pour another round of champagne. I heard the popping of the cork and the expensive liquid filling their crystal glasses. Bradley offered a final toast. He raised his glass and toasted to my swift, quiet departure. He literally thanked me for working myself to the bone so they could all live like absolute royalty. Diane laughed brightly, echoing his cruel sentiment. Caldwell murmured his agreement, and Megan added a cold, sharp cheer. The four people I had trusted most in this entire world were gleefully dancing on my grave before I was even fully dead. I pulled the headphones off my ears, dropping them onto my desk. The silence was deafening. My hands were no longer shaking. The suffocating sorrow completely evaporated. It was replaced by a calm fury. The truth was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. They thought I was a clueless, dying old man, easily manipulated for their personal gain. They underestimated the monster they had awakened. I had built an empire by destroying men who were far smarter and infinitely more dangerous than these pathetic parasites. They wanted a war for my legacy. I was going to give them an absolute massacre. I stood up, my mind operating with surgical precision. I knew exactly what needed to be done. The time for playing the weak victim was over. I was Harrison Cole, and I was going to unleash hell upon every single one of them. The audio feed hissed softly in my ears as I sat perfectly still in the dark. I possessed every single piece of evidence I needed to destroy them all. But I could not bring myself to take off the headphones just yet. I was paralyzed by a morbid, terrifying fascination. I needed to hear the absolute depths of their depravity. I needed to know exactly how far the rot had spread inside the people I had supported and loved for decades. Through the digital transmission, I heard the faint clinking of crystal champagne glasses echoing across the spacious living room of the penthouse. It was a sickening sound of celebration. They were comfortably settling into the luxurious leather sofas, purchased with my stolen money, completely relaxed and entirely confident in their flawless victory. The cheerful atmosphere, however, began to sour very quickly. Bradley was pacing heavily across the hardwood floor. His heavy footsteps reverberated through the hidden microphone with a dull, rhythmic thud. My son was sweating. I could hear the sharp, ragged edge of genuine panic creeping into his breathing. He stopped pacing, and his voice cracked violently as he addressed the room. He told them he could not wait any longer. Bradley whined with the pathetic desperation of a cornered animal, complaining that the old man was simply taking way too long to die. He told them the cartel had explicitly given him exactly 1 month to deliver the massive $15 million payment. If he missed that rigid deadline, they were not going to ask for an extension. They were going to kill him. He turned his frantic attention directly to Dr. Caldwell. Bradley demanded action. He practically begged the arrogant physician to intervene. He said, "Preston, you need to up the dose." He wanted Caldwell to double the daily amount of the synthetic paralytic compound to force my heart to stop immediately. He wanted to accelerate my murder because his own miserable life was dangling by a fraying thread. A heavy, tense silence descended upon the luxury penthouse. I heard the soft rustle of expensive fabric as my wife shifted in her seat. When Diane finally spoke, her voice was a terrifying revelation. It was entirely devoid of any warmth or maternal concern. It was a voice composed of absolute freezing ice. She calmly and sharply commanded her son to control his pathetic nerves. Diane told him to be patient and stop acting like a frightened child. She explained the logistics of my assassination with the detached precision of a seasoned corporate killer. She stated clearly that a sudden massive heart attack at 70 years old was perfectly believable to the authorities and the medical examiners. It fit the narrative they had spent 6 months carefully constructing. But if they suddenly doubled the dosage of the chemical compound, it might trigger a violent, unnatural reaction. It might leave lingering toxicological traces during a mandatory autopsy. Diane told her son to just let the medicine work naturally. She firmly refused to alter the dosage because a rushed mistake would jeopardize her immaculate inheritance. Then she delivered a line that shattered the final remaining piece of my broken heart. She laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed mercilessly through my headphones. Diane stated that she absolutely refused to spend her glorious 60s rotting away in a sterile concrete prison cell when she could be sipping champagne in Paris. She was willing to let her only son squirm in terror under the threat of a violent cartel execution rather than risk her own luxurious retirement. She was not protecting him. She was only protecting her own golden parachute. The absolute sociopathic cruelty of her statement hung heavily in the air. Even Caldwell remained entirely silent, clearly unsettled by the sheer depth of the freezing vanity of my wife. Listening to that chilling exchange was the defining moment of my entire existence. In the suffocating darkness of my private study, a profound and irreversible transformation occurred deep inside my soul. Every single trace of lingering paternal love I held for Bradley completely evaporated. Every fond memory I had constructed with Diane instantly turned into worthless ash. The compassionate, generous father and the devoted, loving husband died right there in that leather chair. I stopped being the benevolent patriarch who desperately wanted to believe in the fundamental goodness of his family. I reverted entirely to the man I was 40 years ago. I became the ruthless, calculating titan who had clawed his way up from the dirt to build an unstoppable corporate empire. I remembered exactly how to destroy an enemy. I remembered the cold, mechanical precision required to dismantle a hostile threat and salt the earth behind them. They thought I was weak. They believed my silence and my shuffling footsteps were signs of a pathetic surrender. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply gathering my strength and plotting their total annihilation. I took off the heavy headphones and placed them gently on the polished mahogany wood of my desk. I closed my encrypted laptop and sat in the quiet stillness. I was not just going to stop their pathetic conspiracy. Stopping them would simply allow them to scurry back into the dark shadows and try again. I was going to obliterate them. I was going to completely strip them of their stolen money, their unearned social status, and their fake respectable identities. I would expose their crimes to the world and let them burn in the fierce fires of their own unmitigated greed. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the tall windows overlooking my vast manicured estate. The moon was shining brightly, casting a pale silver light across the frozen landscape. I felt a surge of raw, terrible power coursing through my veins. The medication was completely out of my system, and my mind was operating with flawless, strategic clarity. I had to move swiftly and decisively. Jonathan Reed was already auditing the Apex Ventures shell company and preparing to freeze the $20 million transfer. Victor Shaw had eyes and ears, their every single movement. The trap was perfectly constructed, but I needed to execute the final blow in person. I needed to look directly into their eyes when the walls finally collapsed around them. I walked back to my desk and picked up my secure prepaid cell phone. I dialed Jonathan's number and waited for him to answer. It was late, but I knew he would be awake working tirelessly on the financial forensics. When he answered, his voice was alert and completely focused. I told him we were changing the timetable. I instructed him to prepare all the final legal documents, the asset freezes, the new will, and the immediate eviction notices. I wanted everything finalized and ready for signature by tomorrow morning. Jonathan did not hesitate. He simply promised that it would be done. I ended the call and placed the phone gently upon the desk. The long, exhausting charade was finally over. I had survived their poison and uncovered their treacherous lies. Now it was my turn to strike back. My absolute revenge was beginning right now. Diane returned to the estate late Sunday evening. She swept through the foyer, dropping her luggage into the hands of the housekeeper. She carried a radiant glow that she tried to suppress the moment she laid eyes on me. I was waiting for her in the library, seated in my wheelchair, a thick blanket draped across my legs. I had spent the afternoon cultivating my appearance of physical ruin. I applied pale powder to my face. I practiced a rattling cough sounding like my lungs were filling with fluid. When Diane knelt beside my chair, her eyes flashed with twisted satisfaction before she arranged her features into a mask of devoted concern. She stroked my cheek, asking how I survived the agonizing weekend without her. I reached out with a trembling hand and gripped her wrist. I forced a wet cough from deep within my chest, telling her my heart was struggling to beat. I told her I was incredibly grateful she was finally home. She leaned in close, whispering that everything was going to be fine. She went to the lacquered cabinet, retrieving the amber prescription bottle. I watched her manicured fingers unscrew the cap and shake out 2 pale blue capsules. She poured me a glass of water and held the pills directly to my lips. She was unaware that I had replaced Caldwell's poison with harmless generic vitamins 3 days ago. I placed the capsules on my tongue, took a painful sip of water, and swallowed them under her watchful gaze. She smiled, kissing my forehead softly. She told me to rest so the medication could help me sleep peacefully. She had no idea that I had never felt more awake in my entire life. I closed my eyes, pretending to drift into a heavily medicated stupor. I listened to her footsteps retreat toward the staircase, leaving me alone in the dark. The discipline required to play the frail, dying victim while my blood boiled with pure rage was exhausting, but it was absolutely essential. I needed them to drop every single defensive barrier they possessed. While Diane busied herself with selecting floral arrangements for her upcoming social engagements, I spent my days secretly orchestrating their total financial annihilation. Jonathan Reed was operating with the silent efficiency of a ghost. During the mornings when Diane believed I was resting, I was actually in my locked office signing stacks of sensitive legal documents. Jonathan brought in a specialized team of estate planners. We systematically dismantled the entire framework of my billionaire empire. The ironclad prenuptial agreement Diane was banking on was rendered entirely useless. Jonathan created an impenetrable series of blind charitable trusts and offshore holding companies. I transferred the vast majority of my liquid wealth, my real estate portfolio, and my corporate stock shares directly into those untraceable entities. The newly drafted will explicitly named my treacherous wife, my deceitful son, and my calculating daughter-in-law. It stated in uncompromising language that they were to receive nothing from my estate upon my death. I legally disinherited them with extreme prejudice. But I did not stop at protecting my future assets. I needed to tighten the noose currently choking my desperate son. I instructed Jonathan to initiate a lockdown on the external corporate accounts. We implemented an immediate freeze on all discretionary capital transfers within Cole Development. Bradley had been relying on his executive privileges to discreetly siphon funds into Apex Ventures. By freezing the accounts, we effectively severed his financial lifeline. Jonathan also placed a rigorous multi-signature requirement on the Riverfront Horizon Operational Fund. The $20 million Bradley needed to pay off his cartel creditors was now locked behind an impenetrable wall of corporate bureaucracy. He could stare at the numbers on a ledger, but he could not move a dime. I knew the moment he realized the accounts were frozen, panic would set in. He would assume it was a temporary banking glitch. He would never suspect that the dying old man was the one pulling the invisible strings. He was a rat trapped in a maze, and I had just sealed the only exit. The perfect stage for their destruction was already being built right in the heart of the city. Diane was turning 60 years old at the end of the month. She had been meticulously planning a massive, opulent birthday gala at the Ritz-Carlton. She had invited over 300 of the most elite wealthy socialites in Chicago. She had hired a renowned symphony orchestra, private chefs, and an army of coordinators. It was designed to be the crowning social achievement of her life. She intended to use the event to subtly showcase her impending transition into the role of a fabulously wealthy grieving widow. I had generously funded the extravagant affair, giving her a blank check to ensure every detail was absolutely perfect. I wanted the room packed with their peers, their colleagues, and their friends. I desperately wanted an audience. As the date of the gala approached, the atmosphere inside my home grew incredibly tense. Megan visited frequently, whispering in the corners with Diane and casting impatient, annoyed glances toward my wheelchair. Bradley was visibly deteriorating. The dark circles under his eyes deepened, and his hands shook whenever he tried to hold a coffee cup. The freezing of the corporate accounts was taking a massive psychological toll on him. He was running out of time, and the brutal syndicate he owed $15 million to was undoubtedly breathing down his neck. He tried twice to bring up the Riverfront Horizon funds, asking if I could sign a quick authorization waiver to clear up a banking delay. I played the confused, exhausted patriarch flawlessly. I told him my vision was too blurry to read the text and promised I would look at it when I felt stronger. The sheer panic that washed over his sweating face was deeply satisfying. He was drowning, and I was watching him sink. Caldwell also increased his visits under the guise of conducting routine house calls. He checked my pulse and confidently assured Diane that the end was mercifully near. He instructed her to keep me comfortable and continue the medication without fail. I watched the four of them orbit around me like starving vultures. They were so blinded by their greed and their desire for my death that they failed to notice the steel jaws of my trap slowly closing around them. The Ritz-Carlton Gala was only 3 days away. The grand ballroom was being decorated with imported white roses and crystal chandeliers. Diane was preparing to celebrate her glorious future. Bradley was hoping my death would unlock the funds to save his life. Megan was anticipating her massive inheritance, and Caldwell was awaiting his wealthy new bride. They were all going to walk into that glittering ballroom expecting a coronation. They had no idea they were stepping directly onto an execution ground. I was going to let them drink expensive champagne and smile for the cameras. I was going to let them feel the absolute pinnacle of their false victory. And then right in front of the entire elite society of Chicago, I was going to burn their lives to ash. The sun rose on the morning before the gala, casting a pale, stunning light through the bay windows of my master bedroom. Downstairs, the sprawling house was a whirlwind of frantic activity. Caterers were carrying heavy silver trays, and stressed event planners were shouting loud directions over the steady humming of vacuum cleaners. Diane was completely absorbed in her own magnificent reflection, aggressively barking orders at her personal assistant about the floral arrangements. I remained securely secluded in my quiet study, sitting perfectly still in my dark leather chair. I was savoring the deep, quiet calm before the undeniable storm. The trap I had so carefully constructed with Jonathan and Victor was fully primed and silently waiting. Every single asset was entirely frozen. Every financial trust was irrevocably altered. But there was one final crucial piece of theater left to perform for the glittering execution at the Ritz-Carlton tomorrow. I desperately needed to give my treacherous son the ultimate false hope. I needed to hand him a golden lifeline that would turn entirely to dust the exact moment he tried to use it. At exactly 2:00, the heavy oak door to my study swung open violently. Bradley stepped inside, and he looked absolutely atrocious. His custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and his silk tie was pulled askew. His face was a sickly, terrifying shade of gray, covered entirely in a thin layer of cold sweat. The deep, dark circles under his bloodshot eyes spoke profound volumes about the sheer terror consuming his every waking moment. The brutal underground cartel he actively owed $15 million to had clearly issued their final deadly ultimatum. He was a desperate, terrified animal backed directly into a pitch-dark corner. He clutched a thick leather portfolio to his chest, as if his actual life depended entirely on it. He forced a wide, unnatural smile onto his violently trembling face and walked slowly toward my desk. He asked me how I was feeling today, his voice pitching slightly too high and cracking with immense pressure. He told me he hated to bother me while I was quietly resting, but there was just a tiny, insignificant piece of corporate housekeeping we needed to clear up before the long weekend. The final desperate lie slipped from his trembling lips with a practiced, sickening ease. He claimed the primary logistics vendor for the Riverfront Horizon development was aggressively threatening to walk off the job if the initial $20 million corporate disbursement was not immediately authorized. I looked up at him slowly, allowing my tired head to loll slightly to the side. I carefully channeled every single ounce of the crushing physical fatigue I had genuinely felt during those 6 agonizing months of chemical poisoning. I let out a long, terrible, rattling cough that violently shook my entire chest, pressing a clean, white linen handkerchief tightly to my pale lips. I whispered quietly that I was so incredibly exhausted. I told him my vision was rapidly failing and that the printed numbers on the complex pages simply blurred completely together into meaningless shapes. The hidden desperation in his wide eyes instantly escalated into absolute panic. He rushed quickly to my side, urgently pulling the thick stack of legal transfer documents from his portfolio and slamming them directly onto my desk. He frantically pointed his finger to the bottom signature line of the final page. He loudly promised me he had personally reviewed every single dense clause and that it was a completely standard, harmless procedure. He practically begged me to just sign my name so he could completely handle the immense corporate stress and finally allow me to rest. I reached out toward the papers with a violently trembling, weak hand. My fragile fingers shook so severely, I accidentally knocked a heavy crystal paperweight off the edge of the desk. It shattered loudly on the hardwood floor, but Bradley did not even flinch. He simply picked up a heavy silver pen from his jacket pocket and frantically tried to press it directly into my weak hand. I firmly refused his silver pen. I slowly pulled open the top drawer of my mahogany desk with agonizing effort. I reached deep inside and carefully retrieved a sleek black fountain pen. It looked exactly like the expensive classic instruments I had utilized to confidently sign billion-dollar real estate deals for over 40 years. But this highly specific pen had been hand-delivered directly to me by Victor Shaw the previous night. It was specially loaded with a highly advanced, customized chemical ink formula. The dark ink would flow smoothly and appear solidly black on the thick parchment paper. However, within exactly 24 hours of exposure to normal oxygen, the complex chemical bonds would completely silently evaporate, leaving the important paper entirely blank and useless. I took the specialized pen firmly in my aggressively shaking right hand. I looked up slowly into my son's incredibly wide, terrified eyes. I told him in a soft, raspy whisper that I trusted him with my entire legacy. The sheer, absolute, sickening hypocrisy of his answering smile almost made me break my careful character. He loudly swore he would definitely make me incredibly proud. I slowly lowered my tired head and gently pressed the sharp metal nib of the pen directly to the parchment. I dragged the dark ink smoothly across the dotted signature line, meticulously forming my full name. It was the absolute crowning performance of a lifetime. The exact moment I crossed the final letter, Bradley let out a sharp, gasping breath of pure relief. He practically snatched the authorized document directly from my desk before the dark chemical ink was even completely dry. He loudly babbled his frantic thanks, constantly promising me that everything was going to be absolutely perfect now. He urgently told me to get some deep, peaceful sleep, and then he instantly rushed out of the dark study, sprinting rapidly down the long hallway, like a desperate man who had just miraculously outrun a massive speeding train. I sat completely alone in the beautifully quiet room, listening closely to the fading echo of his incredibly hurried footsteps. I placed the black fountain pen safely back into the desk drawer and slowly sat up entirely straight in my chair. My hands were suddenly perfectly still. My breathing was incredibly deep and profoundly calm. Bradley truly believed he had just miraculously secured the $20 million to safely save his pathetic life from the violent cartel. He foolishly believed he could confidently walk into the corporate bank early on Monday morning and quickly wire the stolen funds safely offshore. He had absolutely no idea that the massive corporate accounts were already frozen entirely solid by Jonathan Reed. He had absolutely no idea that the crucial signature he was clutching so incredibly desperately to his sweating chest was already slowly beginning to vanish permanently into thin air. He was a completely dead man, blissfully walking into a massive celebration. The quiet calm before the absolute storm was officially over. Tomorrow night at the glittering Ritz-Carlton, the mighty lightning and thunder would finally violently break. The following evening, the Ritz-Carlton ballroom was a testament to excess. I sat in my wheelchair near the edge of the elevated main stage, observing the spectacle I had funded. Over 300 of the most powerful figures were mingling beneath the massive crystal chandeliers. There were prominent politicians and socialites holding flutes of vintage champagne. The room was drowning in thousands of white roses, masking the scent of the impending slaughter. A private symphony orchestra played classical music, providing the perfect soundtrack for Diane's 60th birthday gala. It was the majestic coronation she had craved. She was the center of attention gliding through the crowded room. She wore an emerald silk gown that cost more than a luxury vehicle and a heavy diamond necklace. She was playing the tragic brave matriarch to perfection. I watched her accept hugs from friends leaning in to whisper lies about how hard it was to watch my health decline. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while reveling in the future she had secured. Dr. Preston Caldwell was seated at the VIP table, just a few feet away from my wheelchair. He wore a black tuxedo and carried himself with the smug confidence of a man who believed he had just inherited a billion-dollar fortune. He was casually sipping scotch and charming the wives of aldermen, comfortable in the opulent environment he thought he would soon rule. Every time Diane floated past his table, they exchanged a brief, secretive glance of shared victory. They were practically radiating arrogance. A few tables over, Bradley and Meghan were giving an equally nauseating performance. Bradley looked revitalized. The terror from the previous afternoon had vanished from his face. He believed that the corporate transfer document he had taken from my study was sitting on a bank manager's desk, securing his $15 million salvation. He had no idea that the chemical ink had already evaporated, leaving nothing but a blank piece of paper. He stood tall, laughing at jokes and playing the devoted air. Meghan stood closely by his side, wearing a silver dress projecting the image of a loyal, supportive daughter-in-law. They frequently walked over to my wheelchair, placing gentle hands on my shoulder, and loudly telling the surrounding guests how proud they were of my legacy. I sat silently enduring their vile touches and sweet words. I kept my chin tucked low against my chest, allowing my shoulders to slump forward in a posture of physical defeat. I breathed with a shallow, labored rhythm, giving them the exact dying victim they desperately needed for their public narrative. I watched the grandfather clock near the ballroom entrance. The hands slowly ticked toward 8 o'clock. It was the precise time scheduled for the grand birthday toast. Right on cue, the conductor tapped his baton against his music stand, bringing the symphony orchestra to a graceful halt. The master of ceremonies, a television personality hired specifically for the gala, stepped up to the crystal podium located on the center of the main stage. He tapped the microphone, and the low murmur of 300 guests quickly faded into a respectful, expectant silence. The host spoke warmly about Diane's incredible philanthropic work and her enduring dedication to Chicago society. Then he lowered his voice into a tone of deep, practiced sympathy. He announced that before the dinner service began, Diane's loving husband, Harrison Cole, wished to say a few words to honor his beautiful wife on her milestone birthday. A soft collective sigh of pity rippled through the massive ballroom. The guests turned their sympathetic eyes toward my wheelchair, expecting a tragic display. They expected a frail, dying old man to wheeze into the microphone and hand over the keys to his kingdom. Diane stepped gracefully to the center of the dance floor, positioning herself perfectly under a spotlight so everyone could witness her faux sorrow. She placed her hands delicately over her heart and offered me a look of manufactured, bittersweet love. A hotel staff member hurried over to the back of my wheelchair, preparing to push me up the accessibility ramp toward the stage. I raised my right hand slightly, signaling the young man to stop. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I placed my hands firmly on the padded armrests of the wheelchair. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs with power. And then I stood up. I did not stagger. I did not shake. I did not rely on the armrests for support. I pushed myself upward with a smooth, flawless strength that sent an immediate visible shockwave through the front row of guests. I stepped away from the wheelchair, leaving the thick woolen blanket crumpled on the seat. I straightened the lapels of my custom black tuxedo, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my head high. I felt the overwhelming physical weakness of the past 6 months completely vanish, replaced by the hardened, ruthless energy of a man preparing for absolute war. I walked toward the wooden stairs leading up to the stage. My strides were long, heavy, and incredibly confident. My leather shoes struck the polished wooden floorboards with the rhythmic, booming cadence of an approaching executioner. I walked up the 3 steps without a single trace of hesitation and stepped directly behind the crystal podium. I grasped the edges of the podium, gripping the solid material with unyielding strength. I looked down from the elevated stage directly into the center of the room. I locked my eyes firmly onto Diane. The performance was instantly shattered. The soft, tragic smile completely froze on her perfectly powdered face. Her manicured hands dropped slowly from her chest, hanging limply at her sides. I watched the initial confusion in her eyes rapidly curdle into a raw, creeping terror. She stared at my upright posture, my steady hands, and the returning color in my cheeks. She realized with horrifying clarity that the deadly medication had absolutely failed. I slowly shifted my piercing gaze toward the VIP table. Dr. Preston Caldwell was no longer smiling. His crystal glass of expensive scotch was frozen halfway to his lips. His jaw was slightly slack, his medical mind desperately trying to comprehend the sheer physical impossibility of a dying man standing with the towering, commanding presence of an absolute titan. I looked over at Bradley and Megan. My son's confident, boastful posture had instantly evaporated. He looked small, confused, and profoundly unsettled by my sudden, miraculous resurrection. I leaned closely into the microphone. When I spoke, my voice did not crack. It did not rattle with fluid or weakness. It echoed through the massive ballroom, booming with the deep, terrifying authority of a man who owned the entire building and everyone inside it. I projected my voice to the furthest corners of the room, ensuring that every single elite member of Chicago society heard my exact words. I welcomed them all to the gala and thanked them for gathering to witness the absolute truth about the woman I had married. The trap was fully sprung, and the real performance was just beginning. The silent ballroom waited with breathless anticipation as I gripped the edges of the crystal podium. I looked out over the sea of upturned faces, taking a moment to let the sheer weight of my unexpected presence settle over them. I began speaking in a slow, deliberate cadence. I told the crowd that tonight we were gathered to celebrate family. I paused, letting the word hang heavily in the air. I explained that over the past 6 months, my family had been working incredibly hard on securing my legacy and planning my retirement. I looked directly at Diane, whose face was now a rigid mask of pure white panic. I leaned closer to the microphone and lowered my voice into a hard, unforgiving register. I clarified that they had been meticulously planning my permanent retirement. A confused murmur rippled through the front rows of the audience. Mayors and chief executive officers exchanged uncertain glances. Bradley took a sudden step backward, bumping into a waiter holding a heavy tray of champagne flutes. The delicate crystal glasses shattered loudly against the polished floor, but the sharp sound was completely swallowed by the heavy, suffocating tension rapidly expanding across the room. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. I held it up high for my treacherous family to see. I pressed the central button, and the grand chandeliers above us instantly dimmed. Behind me, 3 massive, high-definition projector screens silently descended from the vaulted ceiling. Diane had enthusiastically paid a massive fortune for these specific screens, expecting them to display a touching chronological slideshow of her glamorous, privileged life. Instead, the giant screens flashed to life with stark, undeniable financial documents. The bright white light aggressively illuminated the horrified faces of my family. I directed the attention of the 300 elite guests to the massive displays. I calmly explained that they were currently looking at the internal banking records of a hidden Delaware shell company named Apex Ventures. I pointed to the glowing red circles highlighting a $20 million extraction from my primary corporate accounts. I looked down at my violently trembling son and calmly announced to the entire room that Bradley Cole had systematically embezzled a massive fortune to secretly pay off an illegal gambling debt owed directly to a ruthless Chicago crime syndicate. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous ballroom. Bradley covered his face with his shaking hands, realizing that the vanishing ink on his fake authorization documents meant absolutely nothing now. I pressed the remote again, and the screens instantly shifted. Now they displayed the official property deed for a sprawling, ultra-luxury penthouse in the exclusive Gold Coast neighborhood. The purchase price of $4 million was clearly visible, paid entirely in untraceable cash. I explained that my devoted wife Diane had selected this opulent love nest as her new sanctuary. I watched her perfectly manicured hands rigidly grip the edge of her table as I revealed her intention to live there with her secret lover once I was conveniently buried in the ground. The wealthy elite of the city were entirely trapped in their seats, witnessing the brutal public execution of a dynasty. I pressed the small button for the third time. The screens shifted once more to display highly complex medical laboratory results. The bright blue headers clearly indicated a comprehensive and highly detailed toxicology report. I turned my piercing gaze directly toward Dr. Preston Caldwell. He was actively sweating, his smug arrogance entirely replaced by the frantic darting eyes of a terrified trapped rat. I spoke directly to him, my voice echoing like rolling thunder across the grand space. I introduced him to the stunned crowd as my trusted personal cardiologist. I methodically explained the chemical breakdown of the synthetic paralytic compound he had secretly prescribed. I detailed exactly how the lethal poison was specifically designed to mimic a fatal heart attack and leave no chemical trace during a standard autopsy. I turned back to Diane, who was now visibly shaking, causing her heavy diamond necklace to catch the spotlight in jagged, frantic flashes. I told the captive audience how my loving wife had meticulously hand-fed me these lethal capsules every single night, while smiling softly and kissing my forehead. I revealed that I had discovered their murderous plot weeks ago and had been quietly substituting the poison with harmless generic vitamins. I had silently watched them celebrate my manufactured physical decline while gathering every single piece of evidence required for this exact moment. Caldwell suddenly pushed his chair back violently, attempting to stand and form a coherent medical denial. He opened his mouth to shout a desperate defense over me, but I cut him off with absolute crushing finality. I stated that forged documents could be contested by expensive defense lawyers, and medical reports could be debated in a lengthy trial, but their own recorded voices could never be denied. I pressed the final button on the black remote. The massive concert-quality speakers surrounding the entire ballroom crackled with a sharp burst of static before broadcasting the crystal-clear audio recording from the hidden penthouse microphones. The entire room listened in absolute unblinking horror as the distinct sound of clinking champagne glasses filled the air. Then Bradley's frantic whining voice echoed through the pristine acoustic system. The recording captured him complaining bitterly that the old man was taking way too long to die. It broadcast his pathetic, terrified pleas about the brutal cartel giving him only 1 month to pay. The guests heard my own son explicitly begging Dr. Caldwell to up the toxic dose and drastically accelerate my murder. The sheer depravity of his recorded words caused several people in the front row to physically recoil in sheer disgust. Megan stood absolutely frozen, her silver dress shimmering, as the reality of her total destruction finally registered in her wide, panicked eyes. Next, Caldwell's smooth, arrogant voice filled the ballroom, promising Bradley that the poison was entirely undetectable and that my massive heart attack was absolutely guaranteed within days. The brilliant physician was forced to listen to his own undeniable confession, broadcast to the most powerful, influential people in the entire city. Finally, the audio feed played Diane's response. Her cold, calculating laughter sliced through the dead, silent ballroom like a physical blade. The massive speakers perfectly amplified her chilling command to let the medicine work naturally. 300 of her closest friends and social rivals listened in absolute shock. As she callously stated, she completely refused to spend her glorious 60s rotting in a sterile prison cell when she could be sipping champagne in Paris. The digital recording laid bare the absolute sociopathic core of her dark soul. She had ruthlessly traded her husband's life and her son's safety for a luxurious European vacation. As the audio playback finally clicked off, the grand ballroom descended into a suffocating, profound silence. No one moved. No one spoke. I looked down at the 4 shattered, broken people who had foolishly tried to murder me for my money. My absolute cold vengeance was finally perfectly and entirely complete today. The heavy silence that followed the final chilling echo of my wife's recorded laughter lasted for only a few agonizing seconds. Then the grand ballroom completely erupted. The collective shock of 300 of Chicago's most powerful citizens shattered into a deafening wave of absolute chaos. Gasps of horror rapidly turned into shouts of pure disgust. Aldermen and corporate executives backed away from the VIP table as if a highly contagious disease had suddenly infected the air around it. I stood behind the crystal podium watching the exact moment the comfortable illusions of my betrayers violently collapsed. Diane was staring at the massive projector screens with her mouth open in a silent scream. Her perfect aristocratic mask melted into an expression of sheer primal terror. She looked around the room frantically, seeking a single sympathetic face among her elite peers, but she found absolutely nothing except raw revulsion. The realization that her pristine social reputation was completely annihilated struck her with a physical force. She let out a piercing theatrical scream and deliberately collapsed toward the polished wooden floor. She expected a dozen concerned friends to rush forward and catch her, but no one moved a single inch. Diane hit the hardwood heavily in her emerald silk gown, sprawling awkwardly among the shattered glass and scattered white roses. Dr. Preston Caldwell did not attempt to help her. The brilliant, arrogant cardiologist was completely paralyzed by the undeniable evidence of his own medical malpractice and attempted murder. He simply sat in his chair, staring blankly at his trembling hands. But my son Bradley reacted exactly as a cowardly rat always does when the trap finally snaps shut. He decided to run. The paralyzing realization that the $20 million transfer was a complete fabrication and that his life was forfeit to a violent cartel finally broke his fragile mind. Bradley shoved his chair backward so violently it crashed into the table behind him. He grabbed Megan's arm, but she ripped her hand away from him, staring at him with sudden, venomous hatred, as if she could somehow distance herself from the sinking ship. Bradley abandoned his wife without a second thought. He turned and sprinted blindly toward the heavy double doors at the far end of the grand ballroom, directly beneath the glowing red emergency exit sign. He pushed wealthy socialites out of his path, entirely consumed by a pathetic, desperate need to escape the room. He never even made it to the handles. Before Bradley's shaking hands could reach the heavy brass push bars, the massive doors violently swung inward. A solid, impenetrable wall of dark tactical gear instantly flooded into the brightly lit ballroom. Victor Shaw led the charge. The seasoned security expert walked with cold, purposeful authority, his eyes scanning the room and locking onto his targets with absolute precision. Behind him marched a highly coordinated strike team, consisting of over a dozen heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and Chicago Police Department detectives. The stark visual contrast of their dark tactical vests, heavy utility belts, and radio equipment clashing against the soft, elegant backdrop of crystal chandeliers and white floral centerpieces, was absolutely poetic. Bradley slammed directly into the chest of a massive federal agent. He bounced backward, stumbling onto the polished floor. The agent did not hesitate. He grabbed my son by the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored suit and violently slammed him face first into the nearest linen-covered dining table. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Bradley's wrists echoed through the room like a perfectly tuned instrument. Victor Shaw walked calmly to the center of the dance floor, holding a thick stack of official legal warrants. He did not need a microphone. His deep, commanding voice cut effortlessly through the chaotic murmurs of the stunned crowd. He announced the presence of federal and local law enforcement and ordered everyone to remain exactly where they were. He then turned his cold, professional gaze directly toward the VIP table. Two large detectives flanked Dr. Caldwell, hauling the paralyzed physician roughly out of his comfortable chair. The expensive Scotch glass he had been holding tumbled to the floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. Victor read the charges aloud for the entire room to hear. He formally arrested Dr. Preston Caldwell for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, medical malpractice, and severe criminal fraud. Caldwell offered absolutely no resistance. His face was a sickly, pale mask of total defeat as the detectives forced his hands behind his back and secured the steel cuffs. He was stripped of his medical license, his arrogant pride, and his future in less than 60 seconds. Across the room, federal agents were systematically dismantling the rest of the conspiracy. Two female agents pulled Megan to her feet. She attempted to scream and protest loudly, claiming she was completely innocent and that her husband had forced her into the financial scheme. Her lies fell on entirely deaf ears. The audio recording of her cold, calculated voice orchestrating the inheritance timeline had already sealed her undeniable fate. The agents secured her wrists behind her back, formally charging her with massive wire fraud, criminal embezzlement, and felony conspiracy. Megan wept bitter, angry tears of pure frustration as they marched her away from the table. Bradley was still pinned against the dining table, crying hysterically and begging for a lawyer. He was officially charged with corporate embezzlement, massive financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes begging for the paternal mercy he had so casually planned to extinguish. I looked down at him from the elevated stage, my expression completely hardened into cold, unforgiving stone. I offered him absolutely nothing. Finally, the detectives turned their attention to the woman lying on the floor. Diane slowly opened her eyes, realizing that her theatrical fainting spell had not saved her from the brutal reality of the moment. Two officers leaned down and hoisted her roughly to her feet. The emerald silk gown she had chosen for her magnificent social coronation was now wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. Her heavy diamond necklace looked ridiculous against her pale, terrified skin. Victor Shaw approached her, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. He looked her directly in the eyes and informed her that she was under arrest for the attempted first-degree murder of her husband. Diane tried to thrash and pull away, screaming my name in a pathetic, desperate plea for salvation. She begged me to tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I stepped forward to the very edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had meticulously fed me poison with a soft, loving smile. I told her in a steady, quiet voice that the medicine had finally worked perfectly. I watched the last shred of hope drain from her eyes as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around her wrists. The federal agents firmly grabbed Diane by her arms and marched her toward the exit. She was dragged out of the grand ballroom in front of 300 of her closest friends and most bitter social rivals. The humiliation she suffered was absolute and total. The elite society she had worshipped her entire life watched in stunned, silent disgust as she was paraded through the doors like a common, violent criminal. Bradley, Megan, and Dr. Caldwell followed closely behind her, a pathetic procession of defeated, greedy monsters. The heavy double doors swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off the sounds of their desperate, panicked protests. The Grand Ritz-Carlton ballroom slowly exhaled. I remained standing tall on the stage, breathing in the clean, unfiltered air of my entirely reclaimed life. The venom had been successfully extracted from my home. The lethal rot had been surgically removed from my empire. The execution was flawless. My vengeance was complete. I was Harrison Cole, and I had taken back the world they had foolishly tried to steal. 6 months have passed since that glittering night at the Ritz-Carlton. I am sitting in my corner office on the 60th floor, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The morning sun reflects brightly off the steel and glass towers, casting a warm golden light across my heavy mahogany desk. I am 71 years old today, and I have never felt healthier or more vibrantly alive in my entire existence. The pale, sickly ghost who sat in a wheelchair wrapped in a heavy wool blanket feels like a distant stranger. My lungs draw in deep, effortless breaths. My heart beats with a steady, powerful rhythm, completely free from the synthetic poison that once coursed through my veins. The profound physical weakness they orchestrated has been entirely replaced by an unyielding, formidable strength. I survived their meticulous assassination plot and emerged from the ashes of my own manufactured demise. It is remarkably peaceful here in the quiet altitude of my corporate sanctuary. The silence is no longer filled with the terrifying echoes of whispered conspiracies or the sickening clink of celebratory champagne glasses. It is the pure, untainted silence of a man who has successfully surgically removed a terminal cancer from his life. The swift gears of the federal justice system ground my betrayers into absolute dust with merciless efficiency. Dr. Preston Caldwell was the first to completely break under the crushing weight of the undeniable evidence. The brilliant, arrogant cardiologist who confidently predicted my exact time of death now wears a faded orange jumpsuit. The medical board permanently stripped his license within 48 hours of his highly publicized arrest. His lucrative practice, his sterling reputation, and his elite social standing were instantly obliterated. He was formally convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and severe medical malpractice. He is currently facing 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. During his sentencing hearing, he could not even bring himself to look in my direction. The smug, confident man who had eagerly planned to marry my wealthy widow and inherit my billion-dollar empire wept like a terrified child when the heavy gavel finally fell. He traded his comfortable, luxurious existence for a concrete cell and a metal bed. He will spend the rest of his natural life trapped in a miserable cage haunted by the sheer magnitude of his own monumental arrogance. My son Bradley met a fate far worse than simple incarceration. He was convicted of massive corporate wire fraud, criminal embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. The federal judge showed him absolutely no mercy, delivering a staggering 30-year sentence. But the cold, sterile walls of the federal prison are the absolute least of Bradley's immediate concerns. The ruthless Chicago crime syndicate he desperately owed $15 million to did not simply forget about his massive outstanding debt. They have an extensive, violent network deeply embedded inside the prison system. Bradley now spends every single waking moment living in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. He is locked inside a violent, predatory ecosystem surrounded by the very cartel members he foolishly tried to cheat. The terrible, paralyzing fear he previously tried to mask with expensive, tailored suits and arrogant corporate posturing is now his permanent daily reality. He is hunted isolated and completely stripped of the powerful family name that once served as his impenetrable shield. Megan suffered an equally spectacular fall from her precious high society pedestal. She was fully indicted for her active, willing participation in the massive embezzlement scheme and the murder conspiracy. The cold, calculating woman who ruthlessly planned my exact funeral arrangements was quickly convicted and sentenced to 20 years behind bars. Her designer dresses and exclusive country club memberships have been permanently replaced by a numbered uniform and strict prison schedules. She lost everything she ever craved because her bottomless greed absolutely blinded her to the catastrophic risks of her own treacherous ambition. Then there is Diane, the ultimate architect of my slow, agonizing poisoning. Her profound downfall was the most exquisitely satisfying consequence of them all. She had been absolutely certain that her ironclad prenuptial agreement would securely guarantee her a life of limitless luxury, regardless of my tragic, sudden demise. She was completely unaware of the hidden felony clause Jonathan Reed and I had quietly embedded into the original legal text nearly 2 decades ago. The extremely specific legal provision dictated that if either party committed a felony directly against the other, the entire financial agreement was immediately entirely null and void. Because Diane was formally convicted of attempted first-degree murder, she triggered that precise legal trap. She was utterly and permanently stripped of every single penny. She did not receive the sprawling estate. She did not receive the offshore trusts. She did not receive the massive corporate stock portfolios. She was left absolutely destitute, penniless, and completely humiliated in front of the entire city she had worshipped. She now resides in a cramped, dismal state-funded correctional facility. She will spend her glorious 60s and the remaining decades of her wretched life locked away from the glamorous world she valued above everything else. Her precious diamonds and emerald silk gowns are gone forever. I sit at my desk and look down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished mahogany surface. They are the final authorization papers for the Riverfront Horizon Development Project. It is the exact same massive $150 million venture that Bradley tried to ruthlessly leverage for his own pathetic survival. I am not authorizing the funds for a greedy corporate expansion. I am signing the entire project over to a newly established philanthropic trust. This massive permanent trust is specifically designed to completely fund young, hard-working men and women from impoverished, working-class neighborhoods. It will provide the necessary capital, the vital resources, and the essential mentorship for brilliant individuals who simply need a genuine opportunity to build their own independent businesses. I remember the relentless burning ambition I felt when I was just a young man starting out with absolutely nothing but a relentless drive to succeed. I want to nurture that exact same fire in others. I want to actively reward genuine integrity, tireless effort, and honest labor instead of blindly funding the toxic, unearned entitlement of a spoiled, treacherous family. I pick up my silver fountain pen and press the sharp metallic nib firmly against the thick white paper. I trace my signature with smooth, bold, confident strokes. I am cementing a meaningful, powerful legacy that will positively impact countless lives for generations to come. The terrible, profound darkness that recently infected my sprawling home has now been completely and permanently eradicated forever. I feel absolutely no sorrow for the 4 treacherous people who currently sit rotting in their cold, dark prison cells. They carefully dug their own shallow graves, and I simply allowed them to fall inside. I take a deep, steadying breath and look back out at the beautiful, towering Chicago skyline. The sky is bright, clear, and endlessly vast. My life is entirely my own again. I am Harrison Cole, and my absolute rebirth is finally complete. There is a dangerous misconception that blood dictates loyalty. We are taught to endure disrespect, manipulation, and even abuse simply because the perpetrators share our last name. But true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, honesty, and gratitude. When those closest to you view your love as a weakness and your generosity as a resource to be exploited, you owe it to yourself to sever those ties. Do not let sentimentality blind you to reality. Forgiveness is a virtue, but protecting your life, your dignity, and your legacy is an absolute necessity. Have you ever discovered a painful truth about someone you trusted blindly? How did you find the strength to walk away and rebuild your life? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you want more stories of justice and survival.